My screen share working for you guys? Thumbs up. All right. Well, thanks for being with us today. I'm excited to talk to you guys. It's a beautiful day here in Tennessee. It's about 70 degrees out, and I'm loving life right now. Like I said, like she said, I just recently graduated from PA school in December. In the last couple of weeks, I've had a chance to do some technical rope training in North Carolina, an EMS refresher with the National Park Service, a tracking course in the last week or two. I helped teach a survival class in North Carolina area, and I'm headed to the Wilderness Medical Society conference in Jackson this coming week. So life is good, and I'm happy to be here. So my goals today are not really to teach medicine or too many specific survival tips and techniques, but more to highlight the principles and lessons and things that I've learned from my survival career that I think are relevant to medical providers working in the wilderness context. To that point, I think it's important that a wilderness provider doesn't intend to just show up with expensive gear and drop their clinical training into the austere environment and hope for the best. You need to understand the environment and internalize those factors that complicate backcountry situations and proactively work to get in front of them. So it's a little different than the hospital setting. If you haven't really spent time in the backcountry, if you're a college student, like I know a lot of you guys are, best time to start is now and start gaining that experience and getting the sense of the backcountry. You know, I could give a presentation where I talk about finding water and building shelters and fires and things like that, but I really believe you can't learn that in the classroom, and particularly on a Zoom meeting. You've got to get your hands dirty, put your hands on the materials and experience what works and what doesn't. I do think that it's good to read up and learn tips and look at YouTube and then take that stuff out to the environment and field test it for yourself. So there are great resources, but you got to let the rubber hit the road somewhere. All right. I do think as a wilderness or as a medical provider that if you're out with a group in the backcountry, they're going to be looking at you as a bit of a leader, even if people have their own individual skills. Once you throw yourself out there as a wilderness medical expert, you'll be in kind of a leadership role, and it's important to embrace that and run with it. And I'll be talking about a little bit as we go. So that was thank you for the kind introduction. I think you covered most of the material there. So SEER is Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. I've been a SEER specialist in the Air Force for about 13 years. And we train on global principles. So we teach in a tempered environment, typically the initial schoolhouse for all the air crews out in Spokane, Washington, which is temperate, plenty of snow in the wintertime. But we always talk about those other environments like the jungle, tropics, desert, Arctic, urban, open ocean, those sorts of things. But knowing those tips and tricks and the details of that is really only half the job. The other half is getting 5,000 students a year to go out to the woods for 6 days at a time and make sure that they learn what they need to learn and are still able to safely move on to their job to go fly airplanes, right? And we have a pretty remarkable safety record there. When you put that together, that's about 750,000 training hours per year. And I would say confidently we send over 99% of those students on without any sort of an incident. So a lot of it is much more an assessment and mitigation and working with the environment. And that's the kind of thing I want to talk about. So disclosures, I don't have any connections with device manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies. I do work for the Air Force or the Tennessee Air National Guard, but my opinions don't represent the DoD or the state of Tennessee. I work with the National Park Service under the Department of the Interior, but my opinions don't represent them either. And I occasionally work for Big Pig Outdoors, which I will be citing, making a reference to them at one point here. Okay, so a little bit of introductory material, and I want to get into what is survival, right? A lot on preventive medicine, because I think it's extremely important, and then our conservation of resources and tools and what to bring and how to make sure we're getting the most use out of it. Some mental errors and situational awareness that plays into decision-making in a wilderness context, prioritizing our needs, a bit on trip planning and our emergency plan, and then finally just touch shortly on your role in training. Okay, so, what is survival? We're all sitting here, we're breathing, our heart's pumping and blood's going where it's supposed to, we're surviving. And if we take a day trip, we probably emerge, we survived. Is that meaningful? I don't think it really is. What to me constitutes a survival situation is a situation where we go from a thriving area where we have anticipation of help if we need it. We've got all the resources around us. We've got minimal self-reliance and minimal need to mitigate the environment. We're indoors, or we can quickly get to it. We can change the context easily. As you start to have those two things cross over, where the chance of having someone help you out, external resources and external recovery goes down, your reliance on yourself and your need to mitigate the environment goes up. And the more and more those deviate from each other, to me, is what constitutes survival. So placing that into a wilderness context, we have kind of this spectrum of a lot of different ways that you can function as a wilderness medical provider. You could be just out doing your own thing and run into people and provide some first aid. You could be the designated medic going on a longer expedition and get into expedition medicine, where you know your customer and you have a plan and you bring the medications to treat specific people that have brought you along. Could be your friends, could be someone that's hired you. Then there's the SAR and evacuation world, where you go in kind of first responder and meet people on their terms, possibly based on minimal or not so good information and with limited resources on what you can carry. And then there's the whole world of prolonged field care, which is nursing and wound care and all those things. And then once you bring in those other elements of isolation, being lost, those sorts of things, then you wrap those different roles into a survival context. And the complication kind of along that spectrum, once you throw the survival in there, it goes up pretty fast, and your need to take care of the medical aspect while also managing all the wilderness factors becomes pretty intense. So that's the kind of thing that I want to prepare you for today. I'm not going to get into a lot of specifics of medicine or physiology or anything like that, but more the mindset and things to help you out. Okay. So I borrow this from a buddy of mine who's a team lead for Team BUSAR, which is my search and rescue team, backcountry unit search and rescue. He breaks down these 10 catalysts for wilderness emergencies that are pretty comprehensive. You could probably find something, an outlier that doesn't neatly fit in here, but this is the most of it. And I think it's extremely important to consider these. The obvious ones that we all think about are injury and illness, right? I mean, we know that those can change a situation and turn something from a routine situation into emergency. But these other ones are things that can creep on you, and getting lost, bad weather, changing the circumstances and changing your plans, letting darkness come in, add to that something like an equipment failure or failing to have proper batteries, or getting a cheap flashlight wet and now you don't have what you need in the darkness. These things tend to compound and build on each other. So the more that you're already in a proactive mindset of what could go wrong, what would we be prepared to do for that, the better chance that you don't end up in that survival situation. And that's always the goal, right? So your bread and butter as a wilderness provider is, common things are common, right? Yeah, sorry to the internal medicine folks out there, but there aren't a whole lot of zebras in the wilderness medicine. I'd say they can't happen, but it's not typical, right? You can still have people that have a weird underlying condition that you get a chance to treat, but the reality is you're not going to do a whole lot about it. You don't have your diagnostics and imaging and tests. In December, I went up on a call in the Smokies. If anybody's been to LeConte in Tennessee, this trail that goes up there, and we were told the guy had a blood cancer. It turned out it was polycythemia vera, and he fell on his side and had immediately this massive hematoma within an hour. And it didn't really change what we were doing on scene, right? We're going to give him the same evaluation. We're going to work quickly to get him into a litter and get the team to carry him out. That one involved a little bit of technical rigging to get through a certain cave. But that was an interesting one that sent me to go research some more and figure out why he bled so fast. And dig into it. And then we get in the park at that EMS training, we talked a lot about LVADs. because people at sort of end of life situations tend to like to come to the national parks for one last tour. And so you get some weird medical conditions and cancers and things like that that show up. So not to say that it's not there at all, but your most common things are the common things. So looking at this, my source here is from the WMS journal. This is from 2002 to 2005, based on Knowles criteria and their incidence. Notable here, the average age for your Knowles people is about 22 with a minimum age of 14. But still, what you're seeing vastly, 60, 70% of this stuff is athletic injuries, twists, sprains, dislocations, soft tissue, lacerations and bruising. That's the bulk of it on the injury side. And then on the illness side, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and infections, maybe the occasional allergy. Okay. Another source on that from Knowles, again, 2005, 2010, you see the same stuff, slightly different breakdown, but it's still very similar. This is the stuff that you need to, with your wilderness medical kit, not your same hat that you're wearing at the hospital, with your wilderness medical kit, the smaller one, you need to be prepared for all these things and make it something that you can do in your sleep. One more also from the WMS journal here. This is slightly different. This is talking about the precipitating factors. And it's, again, the most common stuff that you'd expect. And this is the majority of our call outs to the national park where I work. It slips and falls, overuse injuries, and then on the medical side, a previous history that's exacerbated by the environment, right? Hiking too far, lack of food, lack of water on top of an existing medical condition is going to count for the most of this stuff. One thing to note on these studies from Knowles, they don't report on things that they consider routine, such as dehydration, heat, altitude, and cold. And those are also right in your wheelhouse of things that you're going to expect on pretty much any expedition that you want to be in front of. Which brings me to our preventive medicine, right? So it's really cool to be the hero and go in and hoist somebody out or do, trach somebody in the wilderness, but we don't want to do that. We want to have people have a good time. And the way that we do that as a leader in our group, as somebody with this medical knowledge, is to be on top of it and question people and watch their status and to get in front of things, right? So example here, sanitation and hygiene. This is stuff you can find it from AWLS, talks a lot about cleaning your things and sanitation and water and that sort of stuff. But even if you're with people that are experienced in the woods, you don't want to assume that they're all doing it diligently. You want to be sort of the person that's the policeman on that stuff, that the camp's getting taken care of. People are going and defecating where they ought to. Sort of these infections don't happen from slicing yourself and getting a nasty bug. Majority of diarrhea is from poor camp maintenance and hygiene, right? And so hand washing kits, consistent uses of the water treatment. Thinking about foot care and having people actually check it, or keeping an open dialogue with the people that you're with, where they feel open to let you know that something's happening. You get people in a group and they want to be tough and they won't tell you that they've got a hot spot building on their foot, and then it turns into a blister and it can mess up the trip for everybody or end up having a bad time. People should be open, and you should encourage and talk to people and question, like, hey, how's the feet? Periodically here and there, to make sure you can get on that and throw some tape on it and prevent the blister from forming. Getting people to change their socks or air dry their feet. That's a very military thing, the constant sock changes. You hear that all the time from military folks. Hydration checks, making sure that people are actually drinking, especially when they don't want to, if it's cold, that sort of thing. And knowing your cold and heat injuries inside out, know that spectrum, know your signs and symptoms, but also know your people, right? If it's cold out and everybody's having a bad, just kind of bummed out having a bad time, or even worse, if you truly get thrown into that survival context, everybody might be really cold and there may not be a great mitigation for it. But you need to notice the difference when somebody starts to change. They stop shivering and nothing didn't get any warmer, or their personality change is kind of those early ones. Somebody that's normally happy-go-lucky and now they're tuned out, or they're grumping where they don't typically. You want to have that awareness and start to address those things early, because in these rural environments, it's so hard to bring somebody back, especially on the hyperthermia side. We know once we get someone into heat stroke, there's really nothing you can do, right? So really paying attention to this, working on electrolytes, fluid monitoring, utilizing shade, watching for compensatory factors, someone that stops sweating and immediately addressing that, dropping whatever else is going on. Extremely important, okay? And then other things like safety measures, you know, maybe be kind of the parent in the group a little bit, make sure people aren't running through the woods. Watch their pack adjustments during travel, have them loosen the straps and take off their waist belt when you're doing water crossings. It's kind of safety thing. Working with cutting tools, making sure people are aware of themselves, who they're cutting toward, that they've got a safe circle around them, swinging axes, all that kind of thing. As a wilderness medical provider, it's ideal if you spend enough time out there that you kind of grow those eyes in the back of your head and get a spidey sense like, hey, someone is not being careful with their knife, and I'm going to put an end to it before I have to sew them up, right? Okay. Again, this kind of survival thing is dictated and defined by a lack of external resources and a reliance on whatever it is that you brought, right? So when it comes to resources, there's really no guarantee of what you're going to have in a survival situation, except that you won't have it if you don't bring it. But then you get into this question of how much to carry. There's always, redundancy, and you'll hear this this expression of 2 is 1 and 1 is none. And it's not necessarily a bad way to think about things, but where does it end, right? You bring 3 pairs of hiking boots just in case the first 2 wear out? Obviously not, but there are some things that you would want to consider doubling down on. The things that I'm always going to double down on: fire starters, cinders, signaling devices, cutting tools, and water purification. I don't need shelter. I know I can find ways to deal with that in the natural environment, but those other things are stuff that if I'm injured, if I'm exhausted, there's really no good substitute for those things, and I want to have them on me, right? And you're balancing this weight factor versus the utility that these things bring you. We had an example not too long ago. 2 of our park medics got a call. There was a suspected COVID patient. They were about 10 miles up trail in the backcountry at a shelter, and they headed in bringing oxygen. And it smoked them a lot, trying to plan for the amount of oxygen that they would need to get up there, deal with a potential COVID patient, oxygen supplementation, and then also litter him back out 10 miles while being able to maintain oxygen. So it slows them down quite a bit to be able to carry that much. They get there, and it turns out it's a spontaneous pneumothorax. And yes, he was tall, thin, and young, textbook. Thankfully, they were able to get a helo access that day. But if they hadn't, then combine the factors of them carrying that weight going 10 miles in, there's a chance they might not have gotten to this guy in time. It could have gone tension, and the guy could have died, right? So it's always that balance of bringing this equipment that gives you the most options versus weight, especially as a first responder. And any survival situation really hinges on the balance of these 5 things that I list here. Your sweat, which is water in and water out. Your energy, which you get from food and from calories and from external heat. Whenever you go out and work, you're expending energy that you have to replace. You're making a time cost that you can't get back. You're making a choice between one thing or another whenever you throw your effort into something. Then you have your expendable materials like your water purification, your tinders, and things like that slowly dwindle as you go. And then everything has to be assessed against an injury risk as well. So to dive down into those just a little bit more, we want to conserve sweat, Anytime that you're sweating and putting effort into something, that's water you have to put back and able to function. And to be able to replace that water in a survival context requires time expenditure to go look for it. You're going to have to walk around expending more calories rather than resting. If you're using water tablets, those are gone once you put them in. Or if you're going to build a fire and decide you're going to boil, that's its own set of challenges, and it's its own sweat and calorie expenditure and resource expenditure just to get a fire and boil. Plus, there's a risk of leaving camp, losing your stuff, injuring yourself while you're out, getting an immersion injury or falling into the water while trying to gather it. It's all complicated. You have to think about these things. Very same situation with calories. As we burn through them, we need to replace that through either work or heat if we're getting cold. It's kind of the same thing. How are we going to get those back in our body? We have what we bring. We have some food sources, some MREs, or backpackers pantry, whatever. But where's it going to come from once we're done with those? And then time. You don't get time back, so you have to make these decisions in the context of weather that can move in, the time of day, and whether darkness is going to fall on you, temperature variation throughout the day, and making decisions based on that. What are you going to do? There'll always be these competing priorities. Then your expendable materials that you can't get back. You can improvise perhaps to make up for those, and you can use the natural environment. There are man-made tinders and there are natural tinders. And ideally, you would use natural stuff as long as possible and save your man-made tinders for the worst possible circumstances when you're immersed and freezing and there's rain coming down or something like that. But you also need the knowledge to be able to use those natural. You don't know how to do it, you're stuck with your man-mades. So another one where kind of the maxim there is the more you know, the less you have to carry. So another reason to get out there and train. Kind of talked about the risk of injury, using cutting tools, but always weighing that, your hands, your feet, and your eyes are such absolutely critical resources. You injure a hand and don't have that in a survival context, it's going to severely hamper your ability to take care of your needs, right? So some things to watch out for, particularly for this, watching out for knives and vegetation, getting sliced on rocks and thorns, watching out for use of the fire and burns and abrasions, getting poked in the eye or getting a corneal abrasion. This is the stuff that will be a game changer if it happens to you and you're truly self-sufficient. Thinking about tools, the most important thing that you have is your own strong mindset, a positive mental attitude, and a will to survive, right? You can take that and add minimal tools and get a lot done. And by itself, the best equipment and training won't take you far if you don't really have the mindset to make it happen. This graphic sort of lays out how those combine. If you don't have great training, but you've got great equipment and mindset, you can make things work, but it's just not quite as effective. You've got the mindset and the skills, but not good equipment. It's going to be a little harder than it needed to be, but you can still make things happen. But without mindset, you're likely to fail. I like to think about things in kind of a 3 or 4 line system here in terms of my tools. The worst situation is to be with nothing, completely reliant on primitive skills. In our SEER training, we call that a naked man concept. If you've been taken prisoner by the Taliban and they strip you of everything, put you in a jumpsuit and you escape, you're left with your bare hands to try to survive. And there are certainly techniques for that. We've done it for tens of thousands of years, but they're tough. And you really have to spend time to know those and work on it. So much more important is to have a good setup for your first line equipment, right? The things that stay on your first line. For that, I'm talking about, those things that I said that I carry redundancies, your fire starters, tinders, an emergency shelter like a trash bag, signaling options, navigation equipment, gloves, nav tools, a knife, that sort of thing. Then your second line would be the equipment that you carry in your pack. There you've got your sleep and shelter system, changes of clothes and layers, things like your extra water and filtration kits, your first aid kit, and personal food. And then that third line gear is the least essential to you, more your luxury type gear. If you're carrying tents for that are multi-person, if you've got camp stools or an axe or that sort of thing, that's that third line. You really, really don't want to be separated from your second line, and you never separate from your first line gear, right? So you should have a self-sufficient survival kit that stays on your person at all times. For me, it's a chest rig. something that I picked up in the military. Most of the guys in our SAR team use that as well. So this is what I use. This is my standard setup that I've honed over the years. I've got modules basically that I pull out. I've got my standard setup for clothing equipment, and then I pull, if this is going to be a tech rescue mission, I grab these extra items. If it's swift water, I'm going to grab that bag full of that gear. If it's a winter SAR, I'm pulling that equipment into it to supplement what I've got. But the things that are always on my person, my first line gear, never really changes. Kind of getting into mindset things, because we talked about the gear is not great if we don't have a good mindset. First thing that I really recommend is slowing down. We have military folks on our team that come in as new trainees, and they've maybe been through TCCC, right? Your tactical casualty combat care, and they're thinking of their mindset of returning fire and dragging a victim out of the hot zone and that sort of thing. I really like that that line that you see it in AWLS, maybe in NOLS. Don't just do something, stand there, right? Slow down, make sure your decision making is on point and that you're going to apply your limited resources in the best possible way. If we're in the trauma bay of a hospital and we screw up with a syringe or get a line wrong, we can chuck it and grab another one. If we're in the wilderness context, what we carried in is what we have, and we need to make sure that we use all that equipment right the first time. So haste makes waste, right? Except for obviously some circumstances where time is of the urgency. We've got an animal attacking us, we need to fight off a bear. If we've got a tourniquet that needs to go onto somebody with an arterial bleed. If weather is bearing down on us, if we've got the trees falling around us in a windstorm, got choking CPR, or somebody goes down and is soaked in an immersion situation, you got to be ready to move too, right? Another thing that I've come across quite a bit is what I call the sunken cost fallacy. You'll also see this called escalation of commitment, and kind of related concepts would be tunnel vision and target lock, right? So escalation of commitment is a common behavioral pattern where a decision maker discovers that a previously selected course of action is failing, leaving them with a dilemma. Should they pull out and take an alternative, more promising action, or invest more in the initial decision, hoping that it'll work out? And all too often, people stay invested, hoping that they're going to make something work out. I was once asked to consult with a girl who had been selected to go on Naked and Afraid. And to get ready for that consultation, I watched a whole bunch of episodes, and I saw this just rampant in that show, that people would get stuck on something. They built a poor shelter on day one, and they're still there 2 weeks in because they wouldn't just move and realize that time and that energy was spent, but they needed to redo it, you know? On the show Alone, there's a kind of famous example where a guy built his shelter over a creek, and he's even commenting on it once he had it built. He's like, oh, I think this might be over a creek bed. Sure enough, that night it rained, the creek rose, and he was soaked in his sleeping bag, and he was, you know, could have died. I see this in SEER training. You take some really smart folks like fighter pilots and dehydrate them, sleep deprive them, and have them in a context that they're not familiar with, doing something they've never done. And they're batoning wood. You put a knife on the top of a chunk of wood and hit it with a stick, and the knife works its way down. And these guys will pick a method that doesn't work, not what I showed them, and I'll come over and be like, hey, sir, that's not really working for you. And they're like, no, I got it. We're going to make this work. And like, they struggle with it, and they'll just keep doing what they were doing. It's a little bit of hubris maybe, but it's not something that you want to invest your time and energy and potentially get yourself hurt with sticking with something that didn't work. So when in doubt, be willing to admit your mistakes, and then always go back to principles, right? If something involving fire, you know, I see we do these simple fires where all you have to do is go and snap off dry twigs, and they've got a nice snap to them, and students will go over and yank on a limb that won't break off because it's green and it won't possibly burn, but they get stuck with it, and they're just target lock trying to rip that thing off. Like, hey, it's not even a good piece of material. Don't worry about it. There are a billion other sticks in the woods. You don't need this one. You can move on, you know. But those sorts of things can get weird when you're put in an environment you're not comfortable with. Some kind of related psych factors that go with that and things that occur in survival or difficult contexts are frustration, fatigue, impatience, humiliation, resentment, anger, and panic. All those can lead to overinvestment in bad decisions. So that's stuff to be aware of out there. Similar is kind of paralysis conditions, things where you fail to act when you need to. So paralysis by analysis, you know, as medical providers, as med students in particular, you are meant to be analytical and think about it and know a bunch of algorithms, but also think outside the box and be able to create huge amounts of differentials to sort through, and then call for what you need from imaging and that sort of thing. But that's not available, and sometimes there's just a time to act, you know. So you have to sort through that a little bit and make decisions. So the more that you've thought about your situation, the easier it is to act. That's why we go back to those things like those 10 catalysts. And if you've actually thought about how those could occur and what you would do if they happen, it's that much easier to take action and not be thinking about your hundreds of avenues that you could run with it. Another issue can be paralysis by having your expectations flipped. This happened to me on my first medic call in the park. I was still in my didactic year of PA school, and I got a call. It was a woman that had fallen in a creek, and they were saying it was a right leg issue, like absolutely textbook, normal thing that we see all the time. And I got there, and I've got my EMT license, but I've never seen a patient in real life. And I'm like, all right, we're going to go in, we're going to get consent and do airway, and I'm going to start feeling for a pulse. And I go to her radial, and I got no pulse. Like, she's talking to me, her husband's trying with me, like she's clearly not dead, but I got no pulse, and I'm hung up on this first thing. And turns out, once I kind of broke loose and did the rest of the assessment, she had fallen and hit her C6, C7 on a rock and was partially paralyzed, legs down. She had neurogenic shock, and that's why we're not seeing good pulses on her. But like, wait a minute, every student in EMT school had a pulse, and this is kind of what I'm used to, and I thought it was a leg. Anyway, rookie mistake, but that's the kind of thing that can happen. It can definitely freeze you up. So always trying to keep that open mind and go in if if it's a call out type thing to the fact that it may not be as described. There can be kind of the telephone game when it comes to radio calls, especially in the wilderness environment. And then there's kind of psych factors that I discussed earlier. Fatigue and that sort of stuff can also freeze you up a little bit. All right. I want to discuss situational awareness. This is discussed a lot in tactical training in the military. I'm kind of a mind that you either live your life with situational awareness or you don't. And there are these different systems that you see up here, ways of gaining or working on situational awareness. MET-TC is an adaptation of a military thing to kind of plot the mission, understand the factors, which I think is really a good way to evaluate your mission or the plan that you're on. You got STOP A, the OODA loop, PADM. These are all ways to slow down and analyze and then sort through what you see and start some decision making. I'm a fan of this PADM one because it has that modify step, which ties back to being willing to reassess and make changes to your plan. But here's the reality, in my opinion. These models are not nearly as useful as actually just spending time in the wilderness. That's how you get SA. A great book that I recommend is called The Organized Mind by Daniel Levitin. He's a cognitive psychologist. He says here that you can only process about 120 bits per second of information. There's a whole world of experiences and sound and feelings and the wind and the rain and the sun and everybody talking around you and the patient talking and your own clothing and your heat and all this stuff is going on. You can't possibly process all of it. So we have what we call the attentional filter, right? Which is your millions of neurons that are constantly monitoring the environment to select what's important for you to focus on. That's why you can be in a room full of voices, only able to track one conversation, but if someone in the corner says your name, you can still pick that out because you're hearing it all. It's selectively deciding what you need to hear. So the more time you spend in the wilderness, the better your filter starts to understand and let through the right information. So that's really just a call to get out there and do it. All right. When it comes to our needs and prioritizing, I've talked about this quite a bit in terms of devoting resources and picking and choosing what we do. Here's that kind of system that we teach in the Air Force for classifying our needs and understanding our conditions. So I'll try to blast through these a little bit to keep us on time. Here's the listing. Duration's kind of self-explanatory. Thankfully, you probably don't have to worry about the socio-political conditions and induced conditions, which is nuclear, biological, chemical, hopefully. But these are what we're prioritizing. So the environment is the climate, the terrain, and life forms. And this is where I'd really encourage you to become the expert, work and learn in your primary environment where you'll be doing medical work. You know, here in the Smokies, things that I had to adjust to coming from Spokane, where I did my training, Washington, things like rhododendron, we got ginseng, and that leads to ginseng poachers that are out there that we need to be aware of. You know, growing up in Tennessee, I didn't really realize that our highest peaks are still up over 6,000 feet. So there's some altitude and cold factors that still happen, even though it's just the Appalachians. Local snakes, not something I had a big awareness of as a kid, but our team leader's been bitten by snakes twice out here. And first time he went to the hospital, second time he decided he was going to manage it at home. And so that kind of got us all reading up on crotolid and venomation management and that sort of thing. So always be a learner, especially where you'll be primarily working. When it comes to survivor's condition, we've already talked about a lot of this stuff, the abilities that you bring, your limitations of you and your group, those balances of your physical, sweat, injuries, calories, your obligations, right? Military folks, their obligations include evading the enemy, resistance to exploitation in the captive environment, that sort of thing. As a provider, in this context, your obligations are to your patient that you're dealing with, your duty to care, understanding and working correctly within your scope, and thinking about things like abandonment, and then putting those in a survival context. If it's you alone with a patient that end up isolated, there are times you might, for the survival of the two of you, have to abandon your patient to go take care of something, to leave them with their broken limb to go get water. And you would need to really factor in how you're going to defend your decision making in that context. Obviously, I don't think that's abandonment, but you need to set them up and make sure that they're as protected as possible if you're going to leave them. It just gets a little complicated there, right? So here are those 5 needs with their kind of shred outs. Not going to go in deep on any of these because that's not the goal of this conversation, but I do have a couple principles I want to hit on. This is just how we do it in SEER. There are obviously other systems for this. I think it's extremely important that you go out there and get cold and understand how heat loss happens, you know, and then be the person that can mitigate it. Notice that somebody is standing in the snow where they don't have to be, and they're losing heat through their feet. That's one of our, we lose a ton of heat through our hands, through our soles, and through our face, the glabrous skin. So someone standing there is losing it. If they're standing in the shade on a cold day, let's get them out, let's get them some sunshine, vice versa. Someone sitting on a rock is losing it by conduction. They've got their layers open or didn't notice that the pit zip on their jacket is still open and they're getting cold. That's the kind of thing you want to be ahead of and notice, hey, we're going to use that, we're going to insulate you. So again, just proactivity there, understanding the use of your clothing. Shelter, being able to modify and change the environment for your patient. I really like the way that the March acronyms being pushed out into most of medicine now instead of ABCs, because you get past those first interventions on massive hemorrhage, airway, respiration, and start thinking about the hypothermia and working and considering how they're going to be affected by the environment and how that plays into trauma and that sort of thing, right? When it comes to sustenance, one major thing that we really push is that we never ration water, right? You don't look at water over time and decide that you're going to, I think we might be rescued within the next 24, 48 hours, so we'll try to make our water last. That's not the way it's done. You store your water in your body, You stay as hydrated as possible and use that clear mind and strong body to figure out where your next water source is going to be. In the same vein, if you're low on water, you shouldn't be eating food because it's drawing water out of the system to digest. Right? Food is not a major priority in survival as opposed to water. Good sources of water, plants, sources of pure water in the wilderness would be direct precipitation like rain and snow, or if you get it out of the cells of plants like bamboo, barrel cactuses, things like that, that's considered pure and doesn't require purification. Plants as a source of food is not something that you really need to do in the short term. It's not generally worth the risk. It's very low yield in terms of calories compared to what you need. Okay. Where sustenance can play into your illnesses and things, some of these common conditions are stuff that comes up from issues with the food supply, right? Foods that you're not used to, attempting to start eating plants and getting stomach problems, working too hard without proper electrolytes and food, rhabdomyolysis, all that type of thing. Health is your realm, obviously, but in addition, just the physical and stitching, taking care of people with first aid kits, really think about those associated psych stresses that come with an isolating event. Once you realize things have gone down, we're isolated, this is becoming a survival thing, all those stresses that I listed out here become super important to get in front of and discuss and make sure that people are doing okay, and do a little psychological first aid as well, right? And don't forget the value of rest and sleep in the spectrum of taking care of people here. All right. Quickly, a little on signaling and comms. There's really no in today's world to not have GPS, and even once you can afford it, satellite messengers and things like that. It's such a valuable resource. But that being said, just classic analog signaling stuff like your signal mirrors or putting a chem stick on a string and being able to spin it or build a ground to air signal are also super valuable skills that just supplement being able to send out your coordinates. Always a fan of closed loop communications. If we're working in the hospital, out in the wilderness, just recognizing and acknowledging what someone said. Yes, I will do this. I will go get the firewood, rather than ever making assumptions that people understand what you mean. And then a trip plan. I got another slide on this later on, but a trip plan is absolutely one of the most important things. Trip plan accomplishes signaling across time and space, right? And having these conversations about these catalysts within your team or whoever you're going out with so that you're prepared for contingency. The decision, once you realize you're isolated, is a big one that really needs a little conversation. Generally speaking, from a SAR perspective, it's best not to move. Your last known location or where you intended to be is the easiest way to find you. The least distance that you put between yourself and your last known location, the easier it is to search for you. A lot of things come up when the reasons to move would be if there's a threat in your area, like an aggressive animal, too close to a vertical surface or trees in a windstorm. Lack of resources, so you can't take care of yourself, you don't have firewood, you don't have water, or no, you're thriving out there, but you have no contact with recovery and you have no plan to get home. Eventually, you need to change the situation, so you may have to travel to do that. Just a couple short examples of bad circumstances. There's a real famous story. Geraldine Largay disappeared from the Appalachian Trail. She was 68 years old. A retired Air Force nurse. She went off the trail while hiking the AT just to use the bathroom, and got turned around, couldn't find the trail, started trying to go uphill to get a cell signal, couldn't find one, and wandered and ended up 2 miles from the AT. And then she ended up camping, and she lived for about a month, and she kept a journal the whole time. They finally found her body in October of 2015. And she was only about 70 meters of woods from an open area when it was all said and done. But she made the search for her almost impossible because of going all over the place. All right. So trip planning and leaving a plan of where you want to be is extremely important. Thinking sort of from the perspective what the SAR teams would be doing you need a report. So having a trip plan that says when you should be back and where you would be accomplishes that. If someone has that on file, then when you don't return, they can make a call to the right people, give them all the information on where you ought to be, what you're wearing, what your skills are, that sort of thing. And it speeds up the typical phase of investigation and discovery that the authorities have to do. And they can launch people out there to get you, right? So classic example of failing to do that would be from the movie 127 Hours. Aaron Ralston went to go bouldering alone without a trip plan, left behind, had that boulder pin his arm, pretty famously had to cut it off with a Leatherman. You know, all quite possibly could have been mitigated if you just let someone know where you'd be. So again, a shout out to Big Pig Outdoors, which is who I work with. We have a free trip plan on our website that you can use to fill out, and it's basically built off how the National Park Service builds their template for a missing person. So it kind of takes care of all that to move it ahead. Last thing here, this is kind of similar stuff, you know, plans for within the group. I highly recommend that you take your capacity as that kind of subject matter expert in the medical stuff and start training the people around you. If you've got a group that you routinely go to the woods with, or if you've got a SAR team you work with, be that trainer. Get yourself real outdoors time. Practice some simple substitutions with a safety measure. You know, take your jet boil so that you have your source of water and food, but try working with an open fire. Take a tent so that you have it if you need it, but try working with a tarp or a trash bag and seeing how it goes, always with that safety measure in place. And work on scenarios and test people around you. Or if you've got this wilderness club in your college, make up scenarios and practice with each other in the wilderness. So these are some of the things that I do for my team as the training manager. Just got these patient profiles that have a full sample report, as well as an injury situation or illness. So hopefully this inspires you a little bit. Have a good definition of what survival is and drive home the value of preventive medicine, right? Understand how important it is to prioritize and get in front of mental errors that could trip you up, and hopefully inspire you to build a trip plan anytime that you do go out there and experience the environment. All right. Here's some resources. I don't know if you guys publish these slides or if you watch this later on, but these are useful things for you, some apps and resources. Here's how you can get a hold of the Air Force Survival Manual. This is my hard copy, kind of dog-eared, but the newest digital version of it, full color, can be found for free through the Air Force's e-publishing website. So I highly recommend that you get that and put it on your phone. A lot of great information inside there. And then I'll kind of leave this to you as well. If anybody wants to contact me about anything, SEER questions, SAR questions, or if you're in our area, potentially joining our team, we'd love to talk to you. All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. That was such an interesting presentation. And I know I definitely took a lot away from that, and we'll be applying some of those points that you made in my future wilderness endeavors. I'd like to invite, if anyone has any questions, to drop them in the chat and we can ask away. Not seeing any questions yet. Maybe you could just give it one more minute. Seeing some thank yous popped up. Maybe your talk was so all encompassing, no one had any questions. You covered everything so well. All right, if nobody has any questions, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Wells, for volunteering your time and sharing your presentation with us. Again, I learned so much and I am super appreciative. And I'll pass this on to Sarah for an announcement about our next lecture.
Thanks, guys.
Sarah, we can't hear you. No. While Sarah tries to figure out her audio, I did see a question pop up in the chat about when the recording will be available. It should be posted by midnight tonight.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, awesome. Okay. So I'm in my car, obviously, pulled over on the side of the road. So our next talk is with Jason Williams. He is the director of the University of New Mexico International Mountain Medicine Center Diploma in Mountain Medicine program. And he's also a member of WMS, and he does he is setting the international standards for the DIM programs. So this is a really good opportunity for people who really want a career in mountain medicine to learn how to get certified. And he wants to talk about the benefits of Wilderness Medical Society membership for medical students. So if you're interested in learning the ins and outs of getting certified for mountain medicine through a diploma in mountain medicine, which is offered through several universities, but I have done the one at University of New Mexico and can vouch that it's amazing. Definitely show up, and I will put an Instagram flyer out and really promote this, because you can become just like our speaker if in your futures. So have a good night, everybody, and thank you for coming.
All right, I'll go ahead and end this. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.